The morning sun peeked through the old curtains of Frank Harrison's modest home, casting long shadows across his bedroom floor. At 93 years old, Frank was one of the last remaining World War II veterans in the small town of Mill Creek. His wrinkled hands moved slowly but surely as he buttoned up his favorite navy blue vest, carefully pinning his cherished Silver Star medal on the left side. Frank lived alone in the small white house he had shared with his beloved wife Martha for over 50 years. Since her passing 15 years ago, he had created a simple but structured daily routine that kept him going. His daughter Sarah often suggested he move in with her family in the city, but Frank politely refused each time. This house held too many memories to leave behind. Every morning, exactly at 7:30 a.m., Frank would begin his day. He took pride in maintaining his independence, even though simple tasks took longer than they used to. He would wash his face with cold water, comb his thin white hair neatly to the side, and put on his reading glasses that hung from a cord around his neck. The old veteran moved through his house with careful steps, using his wooden cane more for balance than support. The walls of his home told the story of his life through dozens of photographs. There were black and white pictures from his military days, showing the young, strong Frank in his uniform standing proud next to his army vehicles. Wedding photos with Martha captured their happiness on that special day in 1949. Family portraits showed their children growing up, then grandchildren, and now even great-grandchildren. Frank's morning ritual included a short rest in his favorite armchair, where he would look at the daily newspaper headlines. Though his eyes weren't as sharp as they used to be, he insisted on staying informed about world events. Next to his chair sat a small table with a collection of items that meant the world to him. Martha's silver-framed photograph, his service medals in a glass case, and an old mechanical watch that had survived the war with him. At exactly 8:15 a.m., Frank would put on his comfortable walking shoes and prepare for his daily journey to Pete's Diner, 3 blocks away. He had been going there every morning since Martha passed away. The diner's owner, Pete Johnson, was the son of Frank's old war buddy, and he always kept Frank's regular table ready, the one by the window where the morning light was just right. Before leaving his house, Frank would always check 3 things: his house keys, his wallet with the faded military ID card he still carried, and the small notebook where he kept his daily thoughts. The notebook was Martha's idea. She had always told him that writing things down would keep his mind sharp. The walk to Pete's Diner usually took Frank about 20 minutes, though younger folks could make it in 5. He didn't mind the slow pace. It gave him time to notice the small changes in his neighborhood. He would wave to Mrs. Anderson watering her flowers, nod to the mailman Tom on his early rounds, and sometimes stop to pat Mr. Wilson's friendly golden retriever. Along his route, Frank would often pass by Mill Creek's small Veterans Memorial Park. He would pause there briefly, removing his hat in respect for the names engraved on the stone monument. Many of them had been his friends, and he considered himself fortunate to have lived such a long life when many others hadn't made it home. Some mornings, especially when his joints ached from the weather changes, Frank wondered if he should give in to Sarah's suggestions and move to the city, but then he would remember Martha's words. Home is where your heart finds peace. For Frank, Mill Creek was that place. The familiar streets, the friendly faces, and even the challenging walk to Pete's Diner gave his life purpose and meaning. As Frank finally approached Pete's Diner that morning, he had no idea that his peaceful routine was about to face an unexpected challenge. The small parking lot next to the diner, usually empty at this hour, was about to become the setting for events that would change not only his daily routine, but also how the whole town viewed their eldest veteran. The peaceful morning routine that Frank had maintained for 15 years changed dramatically when 5 large motorcycles roared into the parking lot next to Pete's Diner. The bikes were loud and flashy, with chrome parts that sparkled in the morning sun. Their riders, dressed in black leather jackets and wearing dark helmets, seemed out of place in the quiet town of Mill Creek. At first, Frank tried to continue his usual walk, gripping his cane a little tighter as he made his way past the motorcycles. The noise from their engines made him flinch slightly, not from fear, but because it brought back memories of the loud vehicles he had worked on during the war. As he walked by, one of the younger bikers revved his engine purposely, causing Frank to stumble slightly. Pete Johnson, watching from inside his diner, frowned at the scene through the large front window. He had known Frank for decades and had never seen the old veteran look so unsettled. The diner owner started to head outside, but Frank gave him a small wave, indicating he could handle the situation himself. The group of bikers began showing up every morning that week. Their leader, a tall man with a thick beard who others called Snake, would park his motorcycle closest to the diner's entrance. Frank noticed that Snake wore patches on his leather jacket, showing he was part of a group called the Road Warriors. The other bikers, all younger men in their 30s, seemed to follow Snake's lead in everything. One morning, as Frank made his slow approach to the diner, two of the younger bikers started imitating his walking style, exaggerating his careful steps and making fun of how he used his cane. Their laughter echoed across the parking lot, drawing attention from other early morning customers. Frank's face reddened, but he kept his head high and continued walking. Sarah, Frank's daughter, happened to drive by that morning and witnessed the scene. She pulled into the parking lot immediately, ready to confront the bikers, but Frank shook his head firmly. "This is my walk, Sarah," he said quietly but firmly. "I've faced worse things than a few loud motorcycles." Though concerned, Sarah respected her father's wishes, but she began driving by the diner more frequently to check on him. The situation grew more challenging when the bikers started bringing more friends. Within 2 weeks, the quiet parking lot had become a morning meeting spot for nearly a dozen motorcycles. The peaceful sounds of birds and morning traffic were now drowned out by revving engines and loud conversations. Some of the town's other elderly residents stopped coming to Pete's diner altogether, afraid to walk past the intimidating group. Frank noticed that his hands would shake more than usual as he prepared for his morning walk. Yet each day, he put on his navy blue vest, pinned his silver star in place, and stepped out his front door. He had survived battles in the Pacific, lost friends in combat, and lived through the grief of losing his beloved Martha. He wasn't going to let a group of bikers take away the simple pleasure of his morning routine. One particularly difficult morning, as Frank approached the diner, Snake called out to his friends, "Watch this, boys, time for the morning parade." The group erupted in laughter as Frank walked past. Something unexpected caught Frank's trained ear, a distinctive knocking sound coming from one of their motorcycles. It was a sound he knew well from his days as a military mechanic, a sound that meant trouble if ignored. Frank paused mid-step, his cane firmly planted on the ground. The silver star on his vest caught the morning light as he turned slightly toward the group. For a moment, he considered simply continuing into the diner as usual. But then he remembered something his old commanding officer used to say: "Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is extend a hand to those who seem least deserving of it." Taking a deep breath, Frank made a decision that would surprise everyone, including himself. Instead of heading to his usual table by the window, he turned and walked directly toward the group of bikers, his cane tapping steadily on the pavement with each determined step. The parking lot fell unusually quiet as Frank made his way toward the group of bikers. Even Snake, who usually had a smirk on his face, looked surprised by the old veteran's direct approach. The younger bikers exchanged confused glances, unsure how to react to this unexpected turn of events. Frank stopped near a dark blue Harley-Davidson motorcycle that belonged to one of the younger riders, a man with spiky black hair who called himself Razor. The bike's engine was making that distinct knocking sound that had caught Frank's attention. Despite his shaking hands, Frank's voice was steady and clear when he spoke. "That carburetor's going to give out on you soon," Frank said, pointing with his cane toward the motorcycle. "Sounds just like the engines we used to fix in the Pacific back in '44. The bikers looked at each other, surprised that the old man they'd been mocking knew anything about motorcycles. Razor, who had been one of the most vocal in making fun of Frank, sat up straighter on his bike. "What do you know about it, old-timer?" he challenged, though there was more curiosity than mockery in his voice now. Frank slowly reached into his vest pocket and pulled out an old, worn leather wallet. From it, he carefully extracted a black and white photograph, handling it as if it were made of glass. The picture showed a much younger Frank, dressed in his military uniform, standing next to a line of motorcycles and military vehicles. "I was part of the Motor Transportation Corps," Frank explained, his voice growing stronger as he spoke about his past. "We kept everything running. Trucks, jeeps, motorcycles. Sometimes we had to fix them under enemy fire." He pointed to specific parts of Razor's motorcycle. "That sound your bike's making, I heard it 1,000 times in the war. If you don't adjust the fuel mixture soon, you'll be pushing this beautiful machine home." Snake, who had been quietly listening, stepped closer to look at the photograph. His eyes widened as he noticed something in the background of the picture. "Wait a minute," he said, pulling out his phone. He quickly scrolled through some photos and held up his screen next to Frank's old photograph. "Those are the same models of bikes my grandfather worked on. He was in the Pacific too." The tension in the air began to shift. The other bikers gathered around, their previous mockery forgotten as they looked between the old photograph and Snake's phone. Frank's hands had stopped shaking as he pointed out details about the military motorcycles, explaining how they had modified them for different terrains and weather conditions. Razor crouched down next to his motorcycle, watching intently as Frank used his cane to point out where the carburetor problem was likely originating. "My hands aren't steady enough to fix it anymore," Frank said with a slight smile, "but I can still diagnose problems pretty well." Pete Johnson, who had been watching the scene unfold from inside his diner, came out with a tray of coffee cups. He had known Frank long enough to recognize when something important was happening. The bikers accepted the coffee, and for the first time, they'd actually looked at Frank, not as someone to mock, but as someone who might have something valuable to teach them. As they talked, more of Frank's story came out. He told them about the time he had to repair a motorcycle while taking cover from enemy fire, and how that same bike later helped evacuate wounded soldiers. He spoke about the friends he had lost and the bonds formed through shared hardship. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky as Frank shared more stories. The bikers listened with growing respect, occasionally asking questions about both the mechanical details and his wartime experiences. Even Mrs. Anderson, who had been avoiding the diner because of the bikers, stopped to listen as she walked by. Finally, Snake stood up and held out his hand to Frank. "Mr. Harrison," he said, using Frank's name for the first time, "I think we owe you an apology. We've been acting like real jerks." The other bikers nodded in agreement, looking somewhat ashamed of their previous behavior. Frank looked at Snake's outstretched hand for a moment, then reached out and shook it firmly. "In war," he said quietly, "I learned that sometimes the best way to defeat an enemy is to turn them into a friend." The next few days brought remarkable changes to Pete Steiner's parking lot. Instead of mocking laughter and revving engines, the morning air was filled with respectful conversations and the occasional sound of tools working on motorcycles. The bikers had turned the parking lot into an impromptu motorcycle workshop, with Frank sitting in a comfortable chair they had brought specially for him. Snake had done some research and discovered that his grandfather, Thomas "Tommy" Wilson, had indeed served in the same motor transportation course as Frank. He brought in old military documents and more photographs that his family had kept. Frank's eyes lit up with recognition when he saw Tommy's picture. "I knew your grandfather," Frank exclaimed, his voice filled with emotion. "Tommy Wilson. He was the best mechanic in our unit. Saved our lives more than once with his quick thinking." Snake sat down next to Frank, eager to hear more about the grandfather he had lost when he was just a teenager. Frank told them about a particularly dangerous mission in 1944. "Your grandfather and I were repairing vehicles under heavy fire," he explained to Snake. "Tommy figured out how to fix a broken fuel line using nothing but his bootlaces and some chewing gum. Got 5 injured men to safety in that truck." The other bikers gathered around as Frank shared more stories. Razor, who had been the most transformed by Frank's influence, brought his toolbox every morning. Under Frank's guidance, he worked on fixing his motorcycle's carburetor problem. Though Frank's hands were too shaky to hold the tools, his mind was sharp as ever when it came to mechanics. Word spread through Mill Creek about the unusual friendship forming in the diner's parking lot. People who had previously avoided the area now stopped by to watch and listen. Pete started setting up an extra coffee station outside, and his business boomed as curious townspeople came to witness the daily gatherings. Sarah, Frank's daughter, couldn't believe the change when she drove by one morning. Instead of feeling worried about her father, she found him surrounded by attentive listeners as he explained the intricacies of vintage motorcycle engines. The bikers treated him with the same respect they would show to a beloved grandfather. One morning, Razor brought his 10-year-old son, Tommy, named after Snake's grandfather, to meet Frank. The boy was struggling in school and felt like he didn't fit in anywhere. Frank noticed the child's interest in the motorcycles and began teaching him basic mechanics, just as he had taught young soldiers decades ago. "You see, Tommy," Frank said, pointing to different parts of the engine, "every machine tells a story. You just need to learn how to listen." The boy's eyes widened with interest as Frank explained how engines worked using simple terms and real-life examples. For the first time, Tommy found something he was truly excited about learning. The local newspaper caught wind of the story and sent a reporter to cover it. When asked about the transformation from being bullied to becoming a mentor, Frank simply smiled and said, "Sometimes the loudest engines just need a little fine-tuning to run smooth." Snake started bringing his laptop to the morning gatherings, recording Frank's stories and mechanical knowledge. "We're creating a manual," he explained to the others. "Frank's knowledge is too valuable to lose." The other bikers agreed, each contributing their own notes and observations to the growing collection. One quiet morning, as Frank watched Razor and Tommy working together on a motorcycle, he pulled out his old wallet again. This time, he removed a small, folded piece of paper, a letter from his late wife Martha. He read her words silently. "Remember, Frank, every person has a story worth hearing, if only we take the time to listen." Frank looked around at the group that had become his unlikely family. The parking lot that had once been a place of intimidation had transformed into a space of learning, respect, and friendship. Even Mrs. Anderson, who still woke by every morning, now brought homemade cookies for what she called Frank's motorcycle class. As the morning sun rose higher, Frank realized that at 93, he wasn't just sharing his past. He was building a bridge to the future, one motorcycle lesson at a time. The transformation of the bikers didn't stop at Pete Steiner's parking lot. As weeks passed, Snake and his group began escorting Frank on his morning walks, their motorcycles moving slowly alongside him like an honor guard. The sight of leather-clad bikers protectively walking with a 93-year-old veteran became a normal part of Mill Creek's morning routine. One morning, Snake noticed Frank looking at the motorcycles with a particular gleam in his eyes. "Mr. Harrison," Snake asked, "did you ever ride during the war?" The other bikers stopped their maintenance work to listen. Frank nodded slowly, a distant look in his eyes. "I rode every day for almost 3 years in the Pacific," he said. There was nothing quite like it. The freedom, the responsibility, the trust we placed in our machines. He paused, running his hand along the handlebar of Snake's motorcycle. "Haven't been on one since 1945, though. Made a promise to Martha that I'd stay safe after the war." Razor's son Tommy, who had become a regular at the morning gatherings, looked up from the engine manual he was studying. "But Mr. Frank," he said excitedly, "you're the bravest person I know. You could still ride." The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge. The bikers exchanged thoughtful glances, and Snake began to form an idea. That afternoon, after Frank had gone home, the group held a special meeting at Pete Steiner. What if we could make it happen? Snake proposed to his fellow riders. Give Frank one last ride, but make it completely safe. The idea quickly gained momentum, with each biker contributing suggestions. Razor, who worked as an engineer in his day job, sketched out plans for a custom sidecar that would be stable and secure enough for Frank. "We could add extra safety features," he explained, showing his drawings to the group. "Special cushioning, multiple secure points, everything to make it as safe as possible." Word of the plan spread through the tight-knit community of Mill Creek. Soon, other local businesses wanted to help. The hardware store offered materials at cost, and the local welding shop volunteered their services. Even Mrs. Anderson contributed by offering to sew custom cushions for the sidecar. However, the biggest challenge wasn't technical. It was convincing Frank's daughter Sarah. When Snake approached her with the idea, she was understandably concerned. "He's 93, she reminded them. "What if something goes wrong?" Snake showed her their detailed plans, the safety features, and the support they gathered from the community. "We care about your father as much as you do," he assured her. "We want to help him relive one of his proudest moments, but we'll only do it with your blessing." Sarah watched through her office window as her father shared another story with the bikers in the parking lot. She hadn't seen him this animated in years. Finally, she made her decision. "Okay," she said, "but I want to check every safety feature myself." The next few weeks were filled with careful preparation. The bikers worked tirelessly on the custom sidecar, testing and retesting every component. Tommy became their unofficial safety inspector, insisting on checking every bolt and connection himself, proud to be trusted with such an important responsibility. Frank noticed the increased activity, but assumed they were just working on regular motorcycle maintenance. The bikers kept their plans secret, wanting to surprise him at the right moment. One evening, as the sun was setting, Snake found Frank sitting in his usual spot in the parking lot. The old veteran was looking through his wallet at the photograph of himself on a military motorcycle. "You miss it, don't you?" Snake asked quietly, sitting down beside him. Frank nodded, his eyes still on the photograph. "There's something about riding that makes you feel alive," he said. "Like you're part of something bigger than yourself." He looked up at Snake with a slight smile. "But those days are behind me now." Snake placed a hand on Frank's shoulder, fighting back a smile as he thought about the surprise they were preparing. "Don't be too sure about that, Mr. Harrison," he said. "Sometimes the best rides are still ahead of us." The morning of Frank's 94th birthday arrived with perfect weather. The sun was bright, the air was crisp, and there wasn't a cloud in the sky. The bikers had chosen this special day to reveal their surprise, and the entire town seemed to be holding its breath in anticipation. Snake and his group had arranged everything carefully. They asked Frank to come to Pete's Diner an hour earlier than usual, telling him they wanted to celebrate his birthday with a special breakfast. Frank arrived at 7:15 a.m., wearing his navy blue vest with his silver star pin shining in the morning light. As he approached the diner, Frank stopped in his tracks. The parking lot was filled with not just the usual group of bikers, but what seemed like half the town. Mrs. Anderson stood near the entrance holding a large birthday cake. Pete had set up tables outside with coffee and breakfast for everyone. Sarah was there with her family, trying to hide her nervous excitement. But what caught Frank's attention was the gleaming motorcycle with a custom sidecar parked in the center of it all. The sidecar was unlike anything he had ever seen, beautifully crafted with chrome details and comfortable seating. A small American flag was mounted on the back, gently waving in the morning breeze. "What's all this?" Frank asked, his voice slightly shaky with emotion. Snake stepped forward, followed by Razor and young Tommy. "Mr. Harrison," Snake began, "for months now, you've been teaching us about motorcycles, sharing your stories, and showing us what real courage looks like. Today, we want to give something back." Razor's son Tommy couldn't contain his excitement any longer. "We built you a special sidecar, Mr. Frank," he burst out, "so you can ride with us." The adults chuckled at his enthusiasm, but their eyes were focused on Frank's reaction. Frank moved closer to inspect the sidecar, his experienced eyes taking in every detail. You could see the careful craftsmanship, the extra safety features, the comfortable cushions Mrs. Anderson had made. His hand trembled slightly as he touched the polished metal. "We've tested it thoroughly," Razor explained, stepping forward. "Triple-checked every component. It's as safe as we could make it." He pointed out the special features they had added, the extra stabilizers, the secure harness, the cushioned suspension. Sarah came to stand beside her father. "Dad," she said softly, "they showed me all the safety measures. I checked everything myself. If you want to do this, you have my full support." Frank looked around at the faces watching him, the bikers who had become his friends, the townspeople who had supported him, his family who loved him. He saw in their eyes not just hope but understanding. They knew what this meant to him. "The last time I rode was in 1945, Frank said, his voice clear and strong. "I was delivering supplies to a field hospital. After the war, I promised Martha I'd stay safe for our family." He paused, looking up at the sky. "But you know what? I think Martha would understand this." A cheer went up from the crowd. Snake helped Frank into the sidecar while Sarah fussed with his jacket and checked the safety harness one last time. Mrs. Anderson quickly took photos with her phone, while Pete handed out coffee to everyone. Young Tommy ran up with something in his hands, a leather riding jacket, sized for Frank, with Motor Transportation Corps veteran embroidered on the back. "We all pitched in to get this made for you," he said proudly. As Frank put on the jacket, he felt tears forming in his eyes. But these weren't tears of sadness or fear, they were tears of joy and gratitude. At 94, when most people thought his adventures were over, he was about to embark on a new one. Snake started his motorcycle, the engine purring softly. "Ready for one more ride, Mr. Harrison?" he asked with a smile. Frank secured his silver star pin on his new leather jacket, adjusted his position in the sidecar, and nodded. "You know, Snake," he said with a grin that made him look decades younger, "I've been ready for this since the day I first heard your motorcycles in this parking lot." The roar of motorcycles filled the morning air as Snake led the procession out of Pete's Diner's parking lot. Frank sat proudly in the custom sidecar, his new leather jacket gleaming in the sunlight. Behind them, 20 bikes followed in perfect formation, creating an honor guard that stretched down Main Street. As they rode through Mill Creek, people came out of their homes and shops to watch. Many held up phones to record the unusual sight, while others waved American flags they had quickly grabbed when they heard the motorcycles approaching. The local police chief had even arranged for 2 patrol cars to escort the group, their lights flashing in celebration. Frank felt his heart soar as the wind brushed against his face. The familiar vibration of the motorcycle brought back a flood of memories, not of the war's hardships, but of the brotherhood he had shared with his fellow servicemen. He looked down at his hands, noticing they weren't shaking anymore. "How are you doing, Mr. Harrison?" Snake called out over the engine's rumble, carefully monitoring their speed to ensure Frank's comfort. "Call me Frank," the old veteran replied with a broad smile, "and I'm doing better than I have in years." His voice was strong and clear, filled with the joy of the moment. Sarah followed the procession in her car, watching her father's expression through her tears of joy. She hadn't seen him look this alive since before her mother passed away. Next to her in the passenger seat, Tommy bounced with excitement, waving at his father Razor, who rode near Frank's sidecar. The group made their way through town, past the Veterans Memorial where Frank usually stopped during his morning walks. Today, they found the memorial surrounded by people holding signs that read, "Happy Birthday, Frank," and "Thank you for your service." The local Veterans of Foreign Wars chapter had assembled in full uniform, offering sharp salutes as the procession passed by. Mrs. Anderson had somehow gotten ahead of the group and waited at her usual spot, throwing flower petals as they rode past. Pete had closed his diner for the morning till he and his staff could join the crowd of well-wishers lining the streets. As they approached the town's lake, Snake slowed the motorcycle slightly. This was Frank's favorite spot, where he had proposed to Martha in 1948. The morning sun sparkled on the water, and a flock of geese took flight as the motorcycles approached, adding to the magic of the moment. "Would you like to make another lap around town?" Snake asked, knowing they had planned only one circuit to avoid tiring Frank. Frank sat up straighter in the sidecar. "Let's do it," he said with determination. "But first, I want to tell you something." Snake pulled over near the lake, and the other bikes stopped behind them. Frank's voice was thick with emotion as he spoke. "When you boys first showed up in that parking lot," he said, loud enough for the nearby riders to hear, "I thought you were going to drag me away from my morning routine. Instead, you've given me something I thought I'd lost forever, the feeling of being part of a team again." The bikers removed their helmets in respect as Frank continued. "In the war, we learned that the strongest bonds are forged when people from different backgrounds come together for a common purpose. You've all proved that's still true today." Snake had to wipe his eyes before putting his helmet back on. Razor reached over and squeezed Frank's shoulder, while young Tommy, who had jumped out of Sarah's car, ran up to give Frank a quick hug. As they prepared for their second lap around town, Frank reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his old wallet. Inside was the worn photograph of him on his military motorcycle. He looked at it briefly, then handed it to Snake. "Keep this safe for me," Frank said. "We'll need it when we're telling stories at Pete's tomorrow morning." Snake carefully tucked the photograph into his jacket, close to his heart. The engines roared back to life, and the procession began moving again. This time, Frank raised his hand to wave at the crowds, every inch the proud veteran and newfound mentor he had become. At 94, he wasn't just reliving his past. He was creating a new chapter in his story, one motorcycle ride at a time. 1 year after Frank's memorable birthday ride, Pete Steiner's parking lot looked very different from when the bikers first arrived. A small plaque now stood near Frank's regular spot, reading, "Frank's Corner, where friendship knows no age." The morning gathering had become a cherished town tradition, drawing people from all walks of life. On this particular morning, Snake stood before a crowd that filled not just the parking lot, but spilled onto the sidewalk. He was dressed in his leather jacket, but it now bore a new patch, Veterans Riders Support, founded in honor of Frank Harrison. 1 year ago, Snake began, his voice carrying across the quiet crowd. "We thought we were just finding a place to park our bikes. Instead, we found a mentor, a friend, and a mission." He gestured to the row of motorcycles behind him, each equipped with a custom sidecar similar to the one they had built for Frank. The bikers had transformed their group into something extraordinary. Every weekend, they now provided rides to veterans from local retirement homes using the same safe sidecar design they had created for Frank. Young Tommy had become their official safety inspector, taking his role very seriously as he checked each sidecar before rides. Sarah stepped forward, holding her father's Silver Star pin. Dad always said that the best way to honor memories is to create new ones, she said, carefully attaching the pin to a memorial board that displayed photographs of Frank throughout his life. The centerpiece was a large picture of Frank in his leather jacket, sitting in the sidecar with the biggest smile anyone had ever seen. Frank had passed away peacefully in his sleep 3 months after his 94th birthday, but not before seeing his impact spread far beyond Mill Creek. News of the bikers' transformation had traveled, inspiring similar groups in other towns. Snake's Veterans Riders Support now had chapters in 3 neighboring states. Razor, who had once mocked Frank's slow walk, now spent his weekends teaching motorcycle maintenance to veterans' grandchildren. Frank showed us that every person has something valuable to teach, he explained to a reporter from the local newspaper. We're just paying it forward. Mrs. Anderson had taken over the role of group historian, documenting their activities and keeping Frank's stories alive. She had compiled a book titled Life Lessons from Frank's Corner, filled with photographs and memories contributed by everyone who had known him. Pete's diner had changed too. The wall near Frank's regular table now featured a mural of a young Frank on his military motorcycle, painted by a local artist. Pete had created a special breakfast called the Veterans Ride, all proceeds going to the Veterans Riders Support Group. As Snake concluded his speech, the rumble of motorcycles filled the air. 20 sidecars, each carrying a veteran from the local retirement home, prepared for their weekly ride. The passengers wore leather jackets similar to Frank's, each emblazoned with their own service details. Young Tommy, now 11 and significantly taller, walked along the line of sidecars with his checklist. "Mr. Frank taught me that safety comes first," he said proudly, adjusting a helmet strap for one of the elderly veterans. "And that every motorcycle tells a story." Sarah watched the scene with tears in her eyes, remembering how worried she had been when the bikers first appeared in town. Now she helped coordinate the weekly rides and even learned to ride a motorcycle herself, teaching other women in the community. As the group prepared to depart, Snake touched the photograph of Frank one last time. The old veteran's words echoed in his memory. "Sometimes the loudest engines carry the gentlest souls." The motorcycles roared to life, each carrying a veteran with a story to tell. The town had changed, the bikers had changed, and somewhere, they'd all believed, Frank was smiling at what his morning walk had started. Above Pete's diner, a new sign caught the morning sun. "Welcome to Frank's Corner, where every journey begins with respect." The legacy of a 93-year-old veteran who chose kindness over fear lived on, not just in the rumble of motorcycles or the stories told over morning coffee, but in the hearts of everyone who learned that it's never too late to change, to learn, or to make a difference in someone's life.